She's already dead. The jungle took her. Don't waste ammunition on a woman who can't walk. Vasquez didn't look back when he said it. He was already moving, already calculating the next ridgeline, already treating the variable that had been Sergeant First Class Dana Carter as something the math had resolved. He picked up his radio, called in her status as Kaye, and stepped into the tree line with the rest of the team behind him. He never heard her breathing. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, subscribe to Valor Stories and follow this one all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The last thing Carter registered before the world tilted was the sound of the RPG, not the explosion. The sound before the explosion, that particular rip in the air that her instructor at Fort Benning had described once as the universe giving you a half-second warning it doesn't owe you. She'd heard it, and she'd moved, and moving had saved her life, and the tree she'd been standing beside had not survived the trade. The blast had thrown her 12 feet into a drainage ditch, running along the eastern edge of the trail. She'd gone in face first, hit the far bank with her right shoulder, and felt something in her collarbone give way. With a sound that was more sensation than noise, a deep crack she felt in her back teeth, she lay still. This was not unconsciousness, this was training. You don't move until you know the field. Sergeant First Class Dana Carter. Call sign Rook, 31 years old, 6 years in the United States Army. 1 tour in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and 18 months attached to a special operations advisory element operating in the Darién Gap along the Colombian-Panamanian border. A stretch of jungle so dense and so deliberately ungoverned that the maps of it were more suggestion than fact. She had qualified expert on every weapons platform her unit carried. She had the highest marksmanship score in her battalion. She had twice been recommended for a specialized reconnaissance track and twice watched that recommendation quietly dissolve, while the men around her received the orders she should have been reading. Voices were maybe 50 feet away. She recognized Vasquez first. Lieutenant Marcus Vasquez, 28 months in country, a man who led with his jaw and his assumptions in that particular order. She'd worked with him for 9 months. She'd spent most of those 9 months being managed, rather than utilized, handed positions of formation that kept her visible enough to count and far enough back to discount. Morrison's down. That was Ruiz, the team's junior comm specialist. His voice was tight with something that wasn't grief, she noted. It was the specific tension of a man looking at a problem and calculating how it changed the rest of the day. You saw her go over? I saw the blast. Nobody walks away from that at that range. A pause. She counted it. 1, 2, 4. Then we move. We're already 12 minutes behind exfil, and that was that. She heard the team reorganize itself. The small sounds of gear shifting, boots finding direction, and then the sounds moved away from her, north, toward the extraction point that was 40 minutes through the canopy and 2 ridges over. Carter waited another full 90 seconds after the last sound faded. When she turned her head and looked at her right shoulder, the collarbone was wrong. Not displaced, not protruding, just wrong. The geometry of it shifted in a way that made the arm feel like a question mark. She could still move the hand. She ran the inventory fast, the way she'd been trained, not because the training made any of this manageable, but because the training gave the mind something to do besides panic. Rifle, still slung miraculously. An HK-416 with a suppressor she'd zeroed herself 2 days before the mission. She pulled it around with her left hand and checked the action, clean. 28 rounds remaining in the magazine. 1 spare mag on her left hip, she confirmed it by touch. Sidearm and M18 still holstered on her thigh, 2 spare magazines. 1 fragmentation grenade, left chest pocket, signal mirror, VS-17 panel, cat tourniquet, her folding knife, her radio was gone. She found the pieces of it in the ditch with her when she swept her hand through the mud. The RPG blast had not been kind to it. So, no radio, 1 bad arm, 19 kilometers from the nearest coalition position. Somewhere ahead of her, a team that had filed her dead and was already writing the report. She did the math the way she'd always done it, not in terms of the problem was enormous and the problem would swallow her, but in terms of the next decision. Just the next one. What do I have? What do I need? What is the first step? The first step was getting out of the ditch. It took her 4 minutes. The collarbone made the left side unreliable in ways she kept having to recalculate in real time. And the ditch bank was wet clay that gave way twice before she found a root system solid enough to hold her weight. When she finally got to the top and pressed herself into the undergrowth and looked at the tree line, she was already running different math. The original mission had been a route survey. Get eyes on the cartel's primary resupply corridor, confirm vehicle traffic patterns, relay coordinates for a Colombian National Police operation scheduled for 72 hours out. Vasquez had the survey data. She'd watched him download it before the patrol made contact. He had what command needed. She didn't have what command needed. She had something else. 3 days earlier, while the team was staging at the forward support element, Carter had been doing what she usually did when the mission was in prep and the senior people were occupying themselves with things that didn't include her. She'd been listening. Not eavesdropping in the dramatic sense, just paying attention the way people pay attention when they've learned that the information they aren't given formally tends to appear informally if they stay quiet and keep their eyes open. She'd heard a name, Fuentes, not the cartel's logistics chief, a different Fuentes, a facilitator, a man who moved between the cartel's operational layer and something older and quieter underneath it, a man whose name appeared in 3 separate intelligence summaries under 3 different aliases, and who had never been placed, never been photographed, never been confirmed as anything other than a pattern in the signal's data. She'd heard Vasquez on his satellite phone. She'd heard him say the name. She'd heard him confirm a time and a location. And she had spent 72 hours deciding whether what she'd heard meant what she thought it meant. And she had not resolved that question before the RPG took the decision out of her hands. She started moving south. South was wrong, by any conventional logic. South was deeper into the gap, away from the extraction point, away from the coalition forward element, away from everything that constituted safety by the standard definitions. But south, 11 kilometers through primary canopy, was a small airfield that appeared on no current coalition map and that Carter had found in a declassified DEA survey from 2019 while reading through archived regional documents on a night when the team was sleeping. And she was doing the thing she always did when she couldn't sleep, which was read everything available and retain most of it. The cartel used it for light cargo. The survey had flagged it as active but low priority. Low priority meant unobserved. Unobserved meant that if Fuentes was in the region and needed to move quietly, that was where he moved. The 11 kilometers took her 4 hours and 20 minutes. She didn't think about the collarbone. She thought about the next 10 feet. She thought about the trail she was cutting through secondary growth, which left sign and which she couldn't help, and about the patrol patterns of whatever security Fuentes kept if he was there, and about the geometry of the airfield as she'd held it in memory for 2 years without knowing she'd ever need to use it. The jungle was hot and wet and completely indifferent to her situation. She passed through it the way something the jungle itself had made, slow and deliberate, setting her feet and reading the canopy and stopping every 10 minutes to listen to the dark. She heard voices before she saw the lights. The airfield was a single strip of packed red earth, maybe 600 meters long, cut from the tree line with the particular rough pragmatism of something built to be useful rather than noticed. 2 low buildings on the eastern edge, a fuel depot the size of a shipping container. 3 vehicles parked under camouflage netting, 2 trucks and something smaller, a utility vehicle of some kind, its shape broken up enough that she needed 30 seconds with her rifle's optic to confirm what it was. There were 9 men that she could count, 5 on or near the strip, 2 at the eastern building, 2 more moving a slow perimeter on the northern tree line. Their patterns were irregular. Not the sharp-cornered discipline of trained security, but the particular looseness of men who believed very strongly in the security of the concept of this place, that the primary protection was its absence from anyone's operational picture. She had been reading it into her operational picture for 2 years. She found a position in the undergrowth at the northwestern edge of the strip, 20 meters inside the tree line, with a clear line of sight to the eastern building and the vehicles. She settled her elbows into the wet earth, and she waited, because waiting was the first requirement of her particular skill, and because the collarbone was making noise that she was going to need to not listen to for as long as this took. At the eastern building, the door opened. The man who came out was shorter than she'd imagined from the signal's profile. 50, maybe 55, moving with the careful economy of someone who'd spent a long time being cautious in environments where caution was survivable and carelessness was not. He was wearing civilian clothes. He spoke briefly to one of the men near the building, checked his watch, and looked at the sky with the focused attention of someone waiting for an aircraft. She had no radio. She ran the problem. No radio meant no way to pass his location to anyone. No way to call in a strike. No way to coordinate and intercept. No way to get what she was looking at to anyone who could do anything with it. She had the information, and she had a rifle, and she had 28 rounds and a broken collarbone, and the man standing in front of her had 9 armed men and a plane coming. She thought about Vasquez filing her dead at the extraction point. She thought about the report that was probably already drafted. She thought about the signals record that had the name Fuentes in it in 3 different aliases and 0 confirmed photographs. She thought about what confirmed meant in intelligence terms and what unconfirmed cost in operational terms. And she ran the math one more time. 28 rounds. 9 men visible, possibly more inside the buildings. Single point of egress on the northern end. 1 vehicle in a position she could potentially use. Collarbone, unreliable, but not non-functional on the left side, with support from. She stopped, thought about it differently. She didn't need to eliminate the security. She needed one thing. She needed his face, confirmed, attached to a location and a time. The DEA database had 3 aliases and a behavioral profile and nothing else. A photograph of Fuentes at a specific airfield at a specific hour tied to cartel logistics. That was the kind of confirmation that took 18 months to build through signals alone. She had a phone. It was not military issue. It was a personal cell she carried in a Faraday pouch in her left cargo pocket. A habit her first intelligence instructor had called a security violation, and that she'd maintained anyway because she'd learned very early that the things you were told you didn't need were often the things you needed most at the worst possible moment. The pouch had protected it from the blast. The phone had no signal out here, but it had a camera. She needed to be closer. 60 meters, she estimated. Enough for a facial image that biometric software could process. The undergrowth between her position and the eastern building ran close to the back wall on the southern approach. If she could get to the southern corner without tripping the 2 men doing the northern perimeter sweep, she'd have the angle. She gave herself 90 seconds to watch the perimeter pair complete their pattern. She timed it. 95 seconds per circuit, 15-second overlap at the northern apex. She'd have the southern approach clear for 30 seconds on each pass. She started moving on the next circuit. 30 seconds was the kind of time that expands or contracts depending entirely on whether you let it. She didn't let it. She moved with the deliberate unhurry of something that had decided not to exist visually, staying low, keeping her right arm pinned to reduce the collarbone's motion, letting the undergrowth close behind her as she went. When the path ran out and open ground began, she crossed it in a controlled walk rather than a crawl, because a crawl catches eyes at distance, but a slow, deliberate walk reads as belonging. She reached the southern wall and pressed flat against it. Fuentes was 8 feet away on the other side of the corner. She could hear him. He was talking on a phone now, his voice low and patient, the voice of a man managing a schedule. She caught enough Spanish. Her Spanish was functional, not fluent, to understand that the plane was delayed. 20 minutes. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't panicked. This was a man accustomed to delays and their management. She took the phone from her Faraday pouch and confirmed the camera was functional. She thought through the angle. The corner of the building would let her come around just far enough to frame him against the open strip, with the vehicles visible in the background as location reference. She would need maybe 3 seconds. 2 shots, ideally. The biometric software preferred multiple angles. One of the security men near the strip said something. Fuentes answered without turning from his phone call. She came around the corner. He didn't see her immediately. She had the camera up, and she took 2 frames before his peripheral vision registered the shape, and his head turned, and in the half-second before recognition became action. She took a 3rd frame, full face, direct eye contact, and she was already moving back around the corner. She heard him say something sharp and fast, and she didn't wait to hear what it was. She was moving south along the building's exterior wall, into the undergrowth at the back edge of the strip, letting the canopy swallow her before the men near the vehicles had fully oriented to Fuentes' reaction. She heard shouting behind her. She counted the voices. 3, then 4. She heard feet on packed earth. She kept moving south and east, away from the direction they'd logically expect, using the secondary growth for cover, putting distance between herself and the sound. She ran for 8 minutes. Then she stopped, pressed herself behind a buttress root the size of a door, and listened. The voices behind her were spreading out. They were looking, but they were looking in sectors, not tracking. They didn't have her trail. The jungle floor here was root mat and dead vegetation. She'd left minimal sign. After 3 minutes, the voices began to consolidate back toward the strip. After 5, she couldn't hear them at all. She checked the phone. 3 images. She looked at the third one. Fuentes, full face, sharp enough. The airfield visible in the background with a detail she hadn't anticipated. One of the trucks under the camouflage netting had a partial plate visible in the frame. Colombian registration. Her intelligence instructor would have called that a bonus and spent 3 minutes explaining why she shouldn't have needed a bonus. She put the phone back in the Faraday pouch. She thought about the problem. She had the confirmation. She had no radio. She was 18 kilometers from the nearest coalition position through primary jungle with a broken collarbone and 28 rounds and no extraction. She started walking. It took her 9 hours. She didn't think about the collarbone during those 9 hours in any way that acknowledged it as a limit. She thought about it as information, how to hold the arm, where to put the pressure, what movements to avoid, and which could be modified. She stopped 4 times to listen for pursuit and twice to reassess her bearing with the sun angle through the canopy. She crossed a river at a point where the current ran shallow over rock and came out the other side muddy to the hip and colder than she'd been before. At 0340 hours, she heard a generator. It was the forward support element. She knew the sound of this specific generator, a Kohler industrial unit that the team's logistics sergeant had complained about for 6 months because it cycled in a way that made it audible at twice the distance it should have been. She'd never been grateful for that mechanical malfunction until right now. She came out of the tree line on the southern approach with her rifle slung and her hands where they could be seen, and she called out her name and call sign twice before the sentry's brain caught up with what his eyes were telling him. The sentry's name was Corporal Yates. He was 22 years old, and he had been told 4 hours earlier that Sergeant First Class Carter was KIA. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone revising several things simultaneously. Carter, he said, not a greeting. More like a test of the word to see if it produced the right result. Get me your S2, she said, and someone who can splint a collarbone. The intelligence officer was a captain named Osi. She'd worked with him twice before and had formed the opinion that he was one of the few people in the forward element who processed information in the right order. Facts first, assumptions second, conclusions last. He came into the aid station while the medic was still working on her collarbone, and he looked at the Faraday pouch she was holding out to him with the expression of a man who had been briefed on a dead soldier and was recalibrating rapidly. What is this? Images, she said. 3 of them. Third one is what you need. He opened the pouch. He looked at the phone. He looked at the images in the order she'd taken them, and when he got to the third one, he went very still in the specific way that people go still when they're looking at something they've been waiting a long time to see. Where? He said. She gave him the coordinates she'd held in her memory. The airfield's location, the description of the facility, the vehicle with the partial plate, the timeline. She talked for 6 minutes. He didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he looked at the third image one more time. The DEA has a biometric file on him going back 11 years, Osi said. No confirmed photograph. Now they have 3, she said. He looked at her. At the splint the medic was taping into place. At her uniform still wet to the hip from the river crossing, at the face of someone who had been filed as killed in action 9 hours ago, and had spent those 9 hours solving a problem that 3 years of signals intelligence had failed to solve. You need to tell me how you knew he'd be there, he said. She looked at him steadily. I read the DEA survey from 2019, she said, and I pay attention. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Vasquez's Kaya report is already in the system. I know, she said. He filed it within 40 minutes of extraction. She said nothing. She watched him process the specific geometry of that. The report filed at extraction speed, no confirmation sweep, a decision that had operated entirely on assumption and convenience. That's a separate issue, she said finally. What's not separate is that in approximately, she checked the time, 11 hours, that airfield is going to have an aircraft on it, and Fuentes is going to be on that aircraft. And if your Colombian National Police counterparts can be in a position to intercept that aircraft, the man who's moving money and personnel for the Cordoba network for 6 years will be in custody before noon. Osi looked at her one more time. Then he stood, and she recognized the movement, the shift from a person absorbing information to a person organizing action. Stay here, he said. I need a radio, she said. You need a splint and fluids. He was already moving toward the door. I'll get you a radio. He got her a radio. She spent the next 4 hours in a field chair outside the aid station with a saline drip in her left arm and the radio in her right hand, supporting OC's coordination with the Colombian National Police's Jungla Commando Unit. A conversation conducted primarily in her functional Spanish and his fluent Spanish and the particular shorthand of two people who understood that they were working a clock that didn't have much left on it. The Jungla unit was inserted at 061. She walked them through the airfield layout from memory, the fuel depot, the vehicles, the perimeter pattern, the building placement. She told them about the 9 visible security men and the probability of additional personnel inside the eastern building. She told them about the northern tree line approach and why the southern vector was cleaner, and what the generator housing on the western side of the fuel depot created in terms of cover and concealment. They asked her how she'd obtained this information. She told them she'd been there. A pause on the line, and then the Jungla unit commander said something in Spanish that translated approximately to the woman who walked through the Darién at night to count the trees. She did not correct the characterization. The aircraft landed at 0714. Fuentes came out of the eastern building at 0718. The Jungla unit moved at 0719. She heard it on the radio. She didn't hear all of it. The contact was brief and the communication discipline tight, but she heard enough. She heard the unit commander's voice shift from tactical to something that sat closer to relief. She heard the words secured and one in custody and airfield is clear. She sat with the radio for a moment after the net went quiet. Then OC was back beside her. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds, which was its own kind of language. The Colombian National Police are going to want a debrief from whoever built that, Intercept said. That's fine. Theater Command is also going to want to know how a soldier filed as K produced imagery confirming a 6-year target. Also fine. He sat down in the chair beside her. Vasquez's report is still in the system, he said. I know, he's going to have to answer for it. He paused, but I want to make sure you understand that the answer he gives, whatever he says about why he filed it the way he filed it, is not going to be the answer that determines what happened. The answer that determines what happened is already on that phone. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means, he said, that I filed a corrected status report at 0400. You're listed as returned from missing, not Kea. The original report is flagged for review. He paused. It also means that Theater Command has been informed that an operator from this element produced confirmed imagery of Fuentes under independent action after separation from her team. The language I used was not ambiguous. Carter looked at the tree line. The sun was up now, coming through the canopy at the angle that made the jungle look briefly like something other than what it was. Something almost reasonable, almost navigable, almost the kind of place a person could move through without cost. He filed me dead, she said. It wasn't an accusation. She said it the way she said anything that needed to be stated clearly before it could be filed and moved past. Yes, within 40 minutes. Yes. OC's voice was level and careful in the way that level and careful voices get when they're being precise about something uncomfortable. He also called your position non-survivable in the report, which is notable because 3 members of the team stated separately this morning that they did not verify the position before extraction. The team medic told me, and I'm quoting directly, "We moved before I could get eyes on her." She processed that. The team medic's name was Gallardo. She'd trusted Gallardo. She thought about Gallardo saying we moved before I could get eyes on her, and she thought about what it cost him to say that, and what it said that he'd said it anyway. What happens now, she said. Formal review of the extraction decision. Vasquez will be interviewed. His report will be compared against the team's individual statements, which, as I've indicated, are already inconsistent with the report in at least 2 places. OC paused. That process takes however long it takes. What doesn't wait for that process is what happened this morning. He reached into a folder he'd set on his knee and produced a printed page, intelligence format, header she recognized as Theater Command level. She read it. It was a confirmation cable. The Fuentes imagery had been passed to the DEA's biometrics unit at 0530. By 0061, they'd confirmed identity match at 94% confidence. The partial plate had matched a vehicle registered to a logistics company that DEA had been tracking as a cartel front for 11 months without being able to tie it to Fuentes directly. The cable used the phrase significant intelligence development. In theater command language, that phrase occupied a specific weight class. The Colombian prosecutor's office, OC said, is going to move on the Cordoba network's financial structure within 72 hours, using this morning's confirmation as probable cause for asset seizure. That is approximately 14 months of signals work that needed one confirmed image to become actionable. He paused. You provided that image. With a personal cell phone, she said. With a personal cell phone and 9 hours of jungle. He didn't smile exactly. Yes. She folded the cable and held it. She thought about the survey from 2019 that she'd read on a night when everyone else was sleeping. She thought about the name Fuentes that she'd heard through a tent wall and filed away without knowing what she was filing it for. She thought about the specific kind of attention you develop when you've spent 6 years being the person in the room that other people assume isn't taking notes. She had always been taking notes. There's something else, OC said. His voice changed in the small way that voices change when a person has decided to say the thing they've been deciding about. She waited. Vasquez's satellite phone, he said. The one you mentioned hearing. We pulled the records this morning as part of the review, the number he called 3 days ago. He paused. It doesn't belong to anyone in our logistics chain. It doesn't belong to anyone in the Colombian National Police structure. The DEA is running it now. She went still. Not the trained stillness of field work, something older and slower. You think he knew, she said. I think, OC said carefully, that the call log and the timing of your team's ambush are going to be looked at very closely by people with more authority than me. And I think that the gap between what Vasquez knew and when your team was hit is going to be one of the things they look at. He held her eyes. I'm telling you because you have a right to know, and because your testimony about what you heard is going to be relevant. She looked at the tree line again, the reasonable-looking canopy, the place where she'd spent 9 hours with a broken collarbone and no radio, building the case that was now in Theater Command's hands. She thought about the RPG. She thought about the half-second warning before it hit. She thought about the way Vasquez had called her status without turning around, the flatness in it, the preformed quality of a conclusion that had already been reached before the words were said. When do they move on him, she said. That's not my call. Or yours. OC paused. But the review board convenes in 4 days. Your surgeon says you're grounded for at least 3. Possibly 5. I'll be ready in 3. He looked at her. At the splint, at the saline drip, at the face of a woman who had covered 19 kilometers of Darién jungle in 9 hours and was apparently negotiating her recovery timeline before she'd slept. I believe you, he said. And he meant it. The review board was not dramatic. That was the first thing she noticed when she walked in 4 days later. A standard briefing room, a table, 5 people seated at it, including a full colonel she'd never met, whose name was Whitmore, and who had the particular stillness of someone who had read a great deal of material before this meeting and was now correlating it against the person standing in front of her. Vasquez was already there. He was seated to the left of the table, with a JAG officer beside him, and the expression of a man who had been doing math for 4 days and had not been able to produce a result he liked. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She gave him the same thing she'd given the jungle for 9 hours. Complete, unhurried attention. No anger in it, no performance. Just the flatness of someone who is present and finished being managed. The JAG officer spoke first. He laid out the framework, the discrepancy between Vasquez's after-action report and the team's individual statements, the satellite phone records, the timeline correlation with the ambush. He spoke for 11 minutes. Carter listened to all of it and watched Vasquez watch his own hands. Then Whitmore spoke. Captain Vasquez, she said, the satellite phone records showed 2 calls to this number in the 72 hours prior to the ambush. The number has been identified as belonging to a logistics coordinator with documented ties to the Cordoba network. She let that sit. I'd like you to explain those calls. Vasquez said nothing for 7 seconds. They're going to find the financial record, Carter said. She hadn't intended to say it. Or maybe she had. They're already looking. The DEA has been in the Cordoba network's accounts since yesterday morning. If there's a payment trail, it's going to appear. Vasquez looked at her. Something moved behind his face, not guilt exactly, because she suspected he'd resolved himself to guilt some time ago. Something more like the exhaustion of a performance that had run as long as it could run. I want to talk about a mitigation agreement, he said, not to Carter, to his JAG officer. His voice was flat and controlled and very looks like. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "We'll take a recess," she said. The door closed behind Vasquez and his counsel and two of the review board's members. Carter stood in the room with Whitmore and O.C., and the particular quiet that a room holds after a significant thing has been said in it. Whitmore looked at Carter for a long moment. "You knew he was going to fold," she said. "I knew he'd been doing math for 4 days," Carter said. "A man who sells information to a cartel and then files a false KIA report on a witness understands liability better than most. When the financial trail becomes visible, the mitigation calculus changes." She paused. "He's been managing variables his whole career. When the variables run out, he negotiates. It's the same skill set." Whitmore was quiet. She had a coffee cup in front of her, and she hadn't touched it. "Sergeant Carter," she said, "I have your personnel file." A pause. "All of it, including the 2 reconnaissance track recommendations that were not processed." Carter said nothing. "Both were submitted by your previous commanding officer. Both were returned without action." Whitmore picked up the coffee cup now. Vasquez was the reviewing officer on both. The room was very quiet. He blocked the track. Carter said it the way she said things that needed to be stated before they could be filed. "Not a question. We believe so. An operator with your profile moving to a specialized element would have moved out of his unit and out of his operational visibility. The review board will address that as part of the broader misconduct finding." Whitmore paused. "It doesn't change what it cost you." "No," Carter said. "It doesn't." Whitmore looked at her for another moment. Then she reached into the folder in front of her and produced 2 pages. She slid them across the table. Carter read the first one, promotion order. "Staff Sergeant to Master Sergeant, effective immediately, with language citing extraordinary operational conduct and independent action, resulting in a significant intelligence outcome." She read the second one, a unit activation order, a targeting element under Joint Special Operations Command. 3 billets, including a team lead slot. Her name was in the team lead line. "The element's mission profile focuses on network disruption in the Darién corridor," Whitmore said. "Theater Command believes the intelligence you recovered from the Fuentes intercept contains enough active targeting data to support sustained operations against the remaining Cordoba network structure." She paused. "You know the ground. You know the intelligence. You built the foundation of what comes next." "I want to finish it," Carter said. Whitmore nodded once. "Medical clearance is your limiting factor. Your surgeon projects 4 weeks to full duty status." Carter looked at the activation order. At her name in the team lead line in standard block type, ordinary looking and entirely extraordinary, she thought about the 2019 DEA survey she'd read on a sleepless night. She thought about a name heard through a tent wall and filed away carefully. She thought about 9 hours in the Darién with a broken collarbone and a personal cell phone and the absolute unglamorous requirement of continuing to move when everything in the environment was organized against it. She thought about Vasquez in that room, managing variables until the variables ran out. She thought about the reconnaissance track recommendation, the one filed when she was 26, the one that had come back without action and that she'd accepted because the system had patterns and she was still learning to read them. And she had told herself there would be another opportunity. There had not been another opportunity. The opportunity had been manufactured into unavailability by a man who had ultimately sold classified information to a cartel and filed her dead in a drainage ditch. "Yes," she said. "Clean. Certain." Whitmore closed the folder. O.C. was already on his tablet, moving to whatever came next. She picked up the activation order and looked at her name one more time. 4 weeks. 4 weeks of physical therapy and intelligence briefings, and building something from nothing, which she had done before in worse conditions with less time and fewer resources and nobody watching. She had done her best work when nobody was watching. That was maybe the one thing she'd take from all of this. Not the bitterness of the years that had been managed away from her, not the weight of a drainage ditch in the Darién, but the specific knowledge that she had always been exactly what the 2-track recommendations said she was, and that the person who had understood that most clearly had been the person most afraid of it. Fuentes was in Colombian custody. The Cordoba network's financial structure was 36 hours from seizure. 3 images taken with a personal cell phone in 3 seconds outside a building in the jungle were going to dismantle something that 6 years of signals intelligence had only been able to describe. She had done that. The activation order went into her jacket pocket. She stood without using the table's edge for support. Her collarbone had resolved enough for that. and she walked out of the room under her own power, moving with the particular deliberate economy of someone who has learned that where you place your weight matters, that the ground doesn't always hold, and that the correct response to that knowledge is not caution, but precision. No one who saw her in that corridor would have known what she was carrying. They would have seen a soldier walking, like she already knew exactly where she was going. She did.